Reverie and Interpretation, Thomas H. Ogden, Ch4. Privacy, Reverie, and Analytic Technique. Part 1. I hold this to be the highest task of two people, that each should stand guard over the solitude of the other. R. M. Rilke, 1904. Debussy felt that music is the space between the notes. Something similar might be said of psychoanalysis. Between the notes of the spoken words constituting the analytic dialogue are the reveries of the analyst and the analysand. It is in this space occupied by the interplay of reveries that one finds the music of psychoanalysis. The current chapter represents an effort to examine some of the methods, techniques, that we as analysts depend upon to help us listen to this music. In this chapter and the next, I shall attempt to describe three separate but interrelated implications for psychoanalytic technique that derive from the understanding of the relationship among privacy, communication, and the experience of the intersubjective analytic third. Ogden, 1992, A, B, 1994, A, B, C, D. As will be discussed, I believe that the creation of an analytic process depends upon the capacity of analyst and analysand to engage in a dialectical interplay of states of reverie, Bayan, 1962a, that are at the same time private and unconsciously communicative. After briefly discussing the concept of the analytic third, I shall address the role of the use of the couch as a component of the analytic framework. This will lead to a discussion of the question of the relationship of the role of the couch to the frequency of meetings. I shall then propose that the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, as introduced and described by Freud 1900, 1912, 1913, fails to facilitate conditions in which reveries might be generated by the analysand and by the analyst, and in fact often impedes the creation of an analytic process. A reconceptualization of the fundamental rule will be suggested. In the next chapter, I shall reconsider commonly held beliefs about the handling of dreams in analysis, and shall suggest alternative approaches that are founded upon a conception of the analytic process as a dialectical interplay of subjectivities of analyst and analysand, resulting in the creation of an intersubjective dream space. The dream dreamt in the course of an analysis is in a sense the dream of the analytic third. A fragment of analytic work will be presented in which a dream is conceptualized and responded to as a product of the intersubjective analytic dream space. The analytic third. Over the past several years, I have developed a conception of the analytic process that is based on the idea that in addition to the analyst and analysand, there is a third subject of analysis to which I have referred as the intersubjective analytic third, or simply the analytic third. Ogden, 1992a, B, 1994, A, B, C, D. C. Baranger, 1993, and Green, 1975, for related conceptions of analytic intersubjectivity. The intersubjective, third subject of analysis, stands in dialectical tension with the analyst and analysand as separate individuals with their own subjectivities. Analyst and analysand each participate in the unconscious intersubjective construction, the analytic third, but do so asymmetrically. Specifically, the relationship of the roles of analyst and analysand structures the analytic interaction in a way that strongly privileges the exploration of the unconscious internal object world of the analysand. This is so because most fundamentally, the analytic relationship exists for the purpose of helping the analysand make psychological changes that will enable him to live his life in a more fully human way. The privileging of the exploration of the unconscious life of the analysand is effected through the analyst's use of his training and experience in the employment of his own unconscious in the service of being receptive to the drift, Freud 1923a, page 239, of the unconscious of the analysand. The experience of patient and analyst in relation to the intersubjective analytic third is asymmetrical not only in terms of the way in which each contributes to its construction and elaboration. It is also asymmetrical in that analyst and analysand each experience the analytic third in the context of his own separate individual personality system, which is shaped and structured by his own form of psychological organization, his own layering and linkages of personal meanings derived from the totality of his history and unique set of life experiences, his own modes of organizing and experiencing bodily sensations, and so on. In sum, the analytic third is not a single event experienced identically by two people. Rather, it is a jointly but asymmetrically construct and experienced set of conscious and unconscious intersubjective experiences in which analyst and analysand participate. The role of the couch in the analytic process. In this portion of the discussion, I shall focus on some implications for technique of the concept of the analytic third as it bears on a critical element of the analytic frame, the use of the couch. In approaching the question of the role of the couch as an aspect of the analytic framework, it is necessary to begin with the difficult question of what it is that constitutes the essential elements of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic process. The framework must serve the process, and therefore, in order to determine whether an element of the framework does indeed facilitate a psychoanalytic process, one must attempt to broadly delineate for oneself the nature of the process. It is clearly beyond the scope of the present chapter to offer a thorough discussion of the fundamental elements that constitute psychoanalysis as a therapeutic process. Instead, I shall simply offer some thoughts on the subject that might serve as a starting point for the exploration of this question. To do so, I shall build upon Freud's conception of the essential elements that define psychoanalysis as a method of treatment. Freud, 1914, held that any line of investigation which recognizes these two facts, transference and resistance, and takes them as the starting point of its work, has a right to call itself psychoanalysis. P. 16. I would suggest the following elaboration of Freud's succinct statement. Perhaps psychoanalysis might be viewed as involving a recognition not only of transference and resistance, but also a recognition of the nature of the intersubjective field within which transference and resistance are generated. Specifically, as discussed above, I have in mind the creation of a third subject of analysis, through which the phenomena of transference and resistance are given symbolic meaning on the analytic stage. That intersubjective construction, the analytic third, is generated through the dialectical interplay of the individual subjectivities of analyst and analysand in the context of their roles as analyst and analysand. The problem of defining the nature of the role of the couch as a component of the analytic framework then becomes a problem of conceptualizing the role of the use of the couch in the process of facilitating a state of mind in which the intersubjective analytic third might be generated, experienced, elaborated, and utilized by analyst and analysand. Utilizing experience in and of the analytic third involves the creation of symbols in the analytic dialogue, predominantly, but not exclusively, verbal symbols, for heretofore unspeakable and unthinkable aspects of the analysand's internal object world. Freud, 1913, viewed getting the patient to lie on the sofa while I sit behind him out of sight, page 133, as two essential, interrelated elements of the analytic setup, which he said he insists upon, p. 134. Both the patient's use of the couch and the analyst being out of sight allowed Freud to give myself over to the current of my unconscious thoughts. P. 134. Although he originally introduced the use of the couch as a format designed to help the patient to concentrate his attention on his self-observation, Freud 1900, page 101. Freud's 1911 to 1915 emphasis in his discussion of the use of the couch in his papers on technique was not on its role in facilitating the patient's capacity to free associate. Rather, Freud's principal focus in these papers was on the way in which the use of the couch affords the analyst the privacy that he requires to do his work. I cannot put up with being stared at while I am listening to the patient. 1913, page 134. This statement is often seen as a reflection of one of Freud's personal idiosyncrasies or even as a manifestation of an aspect of his psychopathology. I believe that such readings fail to appreciate the great importance that Freud placed on the necessity of building into the structure of the analytic setting conditions in which the reveries of the analyst can be generated and utilized. Freud, 1912, insisted that the task of the analyst is to simply listen, p. 112. I believe that the injunction to simply listen was Freud's highly condensed way of suggesting that the analyst attempt to render himself as unconsciously receptive as possible to the patient's unconscious and to attempt to avoid becoming mired in conscious, secondary process efforts at organizing his experience. In sum, Freud, 1913, believed that the patient's use of the couch and the analyst's privacy in his position out of sight, behind the couch, are critical components of the supporting structure, the framework of psychoanalysis. Such an arrangement helps provide conditions of privacy in which the analyst might enter a state of reverie in which he gives himself over to the current of his unconscious thoughts, page 134, and renders his own unconscious receptive to the unconscious of the analysand. Implicit in this discussion is the idea that the analysand in using the couch might also experience similar respite from being stared at and might more easily give himself over to the drift of his own unconscious thoughts, and perhaps also to those of the analyst. Some comments on technique. When I introduced to the patient the idea of the use of the couch in the beginning of an analysis, I explained to the analysand that it is my practice to have the patient lie on the couch while I sit in my chair behind the couch. I go on to explain that I do so because I have found that this arrangement affords me the privacy to experience and think about what is occurring in a way that is necessary for me to do the analytic work. I add that the analysand may find that this way of working also allows him to experience his own thoughts and feelings in a way that feels to him different from his ordinary ways of thinking, feeling, and experiencing bodily sensations. Presenting the use of the couch in a manner that emphasizes my own need as well as that of the analysand for an area of privacy, a psychological space, in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, in which to think and generate experience, represents an important statement to the patient of my conception of the analytic method and of our overlapping roles in it. It has been implicit in what has been said thus far that I view the circumstances required for both analyst and analysand to gain access to a state of reverie to be a necessary condition for the conduct of analysis. One might compare the necessary conditions for analysis to the surgeon's requirement for a sterile field in which to operate. In both the case of the analyst and of the surgeon, knowledge, training, and skillfulness of technique are liable to be rendered inconsequential if the necessary context for the work does not exist. I have come to view the use of the couch as an important contributing element to the creation of the conditions in which reverie might be generated and utilized. At the same time, the patient's use of the couch, while the analyst sits behind it out of sight, is but one set of factors contributing to the conditio 11s that facilitate the creation of an analytic process. Moreover, the fact that the patient is using the couch is by no means a guarantee that an analytic process is being generated and utilized. See Goldberger, 1995, for a discussion of the patient's use of the couch as a potential for transference enactment. The current discussion of the role of the couch in facilitating conditions for the elaboration of states of reverie is not meant to suggest that the analyst should insist, in a spoken or an unspoken manner, that every analytic patient use the couch at all times. Fenichel, 941, Frank, 1995, Jacobson, 1995, Lichtenberg, 1995. There are periods of analysis when the use of the couch is too frightening for the patient to tolerate. Under these circumstances, it would be countertherapeutic for the analyst to attempt to bypass the recognition and analysis of the patient's anxiety by pressuring him to use the couch. Such behavior on the part of the analyst would likely represent a form of countertransference acting out. The couch in analytic practice. With the background of the preceding discussion of the use of the couch, including the analyst position out of sight behind it, as a part of the analytic framework designed to make possible overlapping state of reverie, I would like to come to a brief consideration of a related question of analytic practice. Should analysts restrict the use of the couch to patients being seen 4 or more times a week? This question requires that we return to the matter of what we consider to be the elements that define an analytic process. Since analytic technique must facilitate the analytic process, the question becomes one of examining the role of the couch in facilitating the creation of an analytic process. In other words, does it seem that the nature of the analytic process, as we understand it, is tied to a specific frequency of meetings, for example, 4 or more meetings per week? Or is the analytic process defined by a specific quality of psychological interpersonal experience that may be independent of the frequency of meetings? In an effort to begin to consider these interrelated questions, I shall schematically present a series of thoughts relating to my conception of the nature of the analytic process. The series of thoughts will ultimately address the relationship of the use of the couch to the frequency of meetings. Psychoanalysis is a psychological interpersonal process that requires conditions in which analyst and analysand jointly and asymmetrically generate an unconscious third subject of analysis. 2. The analysis of unconscious transference-countertransference. Experience requires receptivity to states of reverie on the part of both analyst and analysand with which to recontextualize, more accurately, to newly contextualize unconscious aspects of experience. 3. Associational linkages and new contextualization among largely unconscious aspects of experience require that privacy conducive to a state of reverie be afforded to both analyst and analysand. 4. The patient's use of the couch, with the analyst seated out of sight behind the couch, fosters conditions in which analyst and analysand might each have sufficient privacy //th which to enter into their own states of reverie, which states involve an area of overlap. Our therapy takes place in the overlap of 2 areas of playing, that of the patient and that of the therapist. Winnicott, 1971a, page 38. 5. It then follows that the patient's use of the couch and the analyst's privacy behind it provide a means of facilitating access on the part of analyst and analysand to a play space, an area of overlapping states of reverie, that is a necessary condition for the elaboration and analysis of the unconscious intersubjective analytic third, cf. Grotstein, 1995. 6. However else one defines analysis, it seems essential to include in one's definition the effort to generate and experience the unconscious analytic third and to foster a state of reverie through which the analyst and analysand might get a sense of the drift, Freud 1923a, of that shared and yet individually experienced unconscious construction. The analytic enterprise is best defined not by its form, including the frequency of meetings, but by its substance, which involves the analysis of the transference-countertransference, including anxiety/defense, as these phenomena are given shape in the experiencing of and interpretation of the analytic third. It has been my experience that it is regularly the case that increasing the frequency of sessions per week enhances the capacity of analyst and analysand to generate overlapping states of reverie. To my mind, it makes no sense to respond to a compromise of one set of conditions under which an analysis is being conducted by compromising other conditions conducive to the creation of an analytic process. Specifically, it would be difficult for me to understand the logic underlying a decision to work with a patient in a face-to-face manner because conditions conducive to the creation of an analytic process have been compromised as a result of constraints leading to a frequency of meetings that seems to the analyst to be less than optimal. As a result, unless there are compelling reasons not to use the couch in a given instance, I conduct all of my analytic work with the patient using the couch, regardless of the number of times per week that the patient is being seen. Point 1. 1.my use of analytic technique in the service of generating an analytic process. For example, use of reverie in relation to my understanding of my experience of the transference-countertransference, and my use of this understanding in the interpretation of the leading transference-countertransference anxiety does not change in response to the number of times per week that I am seeing a patient. For example, I'll rely no more on suggestion, exhortation, reassurance, and the like in work with patients being seen once or twice per week than I do with patients being seen 4, 5, or 6 times per week.